Vali Nasser, welcome back to the program.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
We want to get your analysis. You're the go-to person about Iran. But can I just ask you baldly, does his death actually matter? Let's just first take in terms of relations with the US or what Iran might do in its external policy.
Not really, because Ra'isi was in no way the architect of Iran's foreign policy, and he was not a big voice in redirecting policies on the region or on the nuclear issue or vis-a-vis Israel. All of these decisions were made by the Office of the Supreme Leader and the National Security Council in Iran.
So, Vali, you mean that it's really Ayatollah Khamenei, right? It's the so-called Supreme Leader who makes all the decisions. And is that likely to change?
No, it's not likely to change. It is the Supreme Leader who makes all the decisions, but there's a national security table in Iran. And usually the president and the foreign minister could be big voices in there. They could move the policy, at least even in certain degrees, in one direction or the other. But Ra'isi, unlike his predecessor, President Rouhani, was not a big voice at that table. And therefore, he was not a big source of support for either talking to the United States or capping the nuclear program or retaliate against Israel. And his silence or his more muted presence at the table resulted in that the Supreme Leader and the commanders of the IRGC and the security forces became even more dominant in charting Iran's foreign policy.
So what do you think now with the death of Ra'isi and with Khamenei having to, I don't know, rejiggle the puzzles? What will happen in terms of its proxies in the Middle East and in terms of relations with Saudi Arabia, as also the US is trying to get a grand bargain in the region?
I mean, the policies were already in place before Ra'isi was killed. The regional issues, the proxy issues are in the hands of the Revolutionary Guards. They're sort of were there before Ra'isi arrived, and they will be there after Ra'isi. And in terms of normalization with Saudi Arabia, now this is something that is embraced by the system as a whole, and it is the consensus of the system. However, depending on who replaces Ra'isi, we can have a bigger momentum in terms of engaging the US and the region, and perhaps even moving towards some kind of a nuclear understanding with the United States.
Mm-hmm. And Vali, what about internally? Because many times when there are shifts of any kind, whether it's the uprising over the death of Mahsa Amini or whether it's this, many on the outside, you know, it's like they're sitting on the edge of their seats hoping that there's going to be some internal upheaval that will finally get rid of the Ayatollahs.
I don't see that happening now. I mean, Ra'isi was not that kind of a consequential figure. But it can be an important change in Iran. Ra'isi was blamed for the hijab issue that caused the Mahsa Amini protest and then for the suppression of it. He didn't do well in addressing Iran's economic issues and was increasingly blamed for the performance of the Iranian economy. Now, this means that now going into presidential elections, there's a possibility that the Supreme Leader would allow a more experienced and better known manager to take over the presidency, somebody who would be politically more moderate than Ra'isi.
If that pans out, what would your recommendation be, for instance, for the United States or others, even in the region, trying to deal with Iran?
So I think that trend with talking to Iran and Iran engaging on de-escalation was already in place. Even a moderately more moderate candidate would give even more impetus to these kinds of engagements with Iran. In other words, under Ra'isi, Iran's foreign policy already hit its most maximum extreme that had been the case for decades. And now moving towards the more middle gives more room for the United States to engage Iran, more room for Saudi Arabia to engage Iran. And one other factor here is that everybody expected the Iranian presidential election to come after the American presidential election. Now it's going to come before the presidential election, which allows the new administration in the US, whether Democratic or Republican, to reboot with Iran more quickly than it had anticipated to be the case.
Vali Nasser, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.